The cold came early that year. By the second week of November 1886, the plains of the Wyoming Territory had already swallowed 3 feet of snow, and the temperatures at night dropped low enough to kill a man who wasn't careful. The sky stayed the color of old iron from dawn until dusk, heavy and featureless, and the wind moved across the open land without anything to slow it down. It cut through wool coats and canvas jackets alike, found the gaps at the collar and wrists, and worked its way in until the cold felt like it was coming from inside rather than out. Gideon Hart knew this country. He had lived in it long enough that he no longer thought much about the cold. It was simply a condition of existence, like hunger or grief, something you managed rather than defeated. He drove his wagon with his shoulders hunched slightly forward and his eyes on the trail, reading the surface of the snow the way a man reads a familiar book. He knew where the ruts were, where the ground softened near the creek crossing, where the wind had packed the drifts hard enough to bear weight, and where it had left deceptive soft spots that would swallow a wagon wheel to the axle. Beside him on the bench, bundled in a wool blanket until only her eyes and the tip of her nose were visible, sat his daughter Clara. She was 7 years old, and she had her mother's eyes, chic, dark brown, observant, inclined toward noticing things that others missed. She had been quiet most of the drive, which was not unusual. Clara was a quiet child by nature, not withdrawn exactly, but deliberate. She watched the world carefully before she said anything about it. They had been to Millhaven for supplies. The trip took most of a day each way, and Gideon made it once a month through the winter months, stocking the root cellar and the smokehouse against the possibility of being snowed in for weeks at a stretch. It wasn't a pleasant journey in November, but it was necessary, and Gideon Hart was a man who did necessary things without complaint. The wagon moved at an even pace, the 2 draft horses blowing steam into the cold air, their hooves muffled by the packed snow on the trail. They were perhaps 6 miles from the ranch when Clara spoke. "Papa." "There's a woman standing over there." Gideon didn't look up immediately. His eyes stayed on the trail. "Where?" "By the station, the old one." He looked then. The Caldwell station had been decommissioned 3 years ago when the main rail line shifted north, leaving behind a small building with boarded windows and a platform that nobody used anymore. The building was barely visible from the trail, set back 100 yards from the road behind a stand of bare cottonwood trees, and in the gray light and blowing snow, Gideon might have driven past it without a second glance. But Clara was right. There was a figure standing on the platform. He pulled the horses to a stop. The figure wasn't moving. It stood in the open on the exposed platform, without apparent shelter from the wind. Even from this distance, Gideon could see that the person was not dressed for the weather. The clothing was pale, almost white, and it moved in the wind in a way that suggested it was not heavy enough for the conditions. "That doesn't look right," he said, half to himself. "No," Clara agreed. "It doesn't." He sat there for a moment, holding the reins, looking at the figure. The practical part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive and functioning on the frontier for 15 years, was making calculations. He was 6 miles from home. The temperature was dropping. He had a child with him. The figure on the platform might be nothing, a drunk, someone who had wandered off a passing coach, some situation that was none of his business. But the figure wasn't moving. In this cold, that was not a good sign. "Hold on," he said, and turned the horses off the trail. Her name was Evelyn Reed, and she was 26 years old, and she had been standing on that platform for close to 2 hours. She knew this because she had been watching the light. She had arrived on the 11:15 from Cheyenne, the last passenger train to stop at the old Caldwell station before it was fully decommissioned, running only because the regular station at Millhaven was being resurfaced, and the rail company had rerouted for the week. She had stepped off onto the platform at 11:15, carrying a single traveling case, wearing her wedding dress. The man who was supposed to meet her had not been there. She had waited on the platform for the first hour thinking he was simply late. People were late. Roads were bad in winter. There were 100 reasonable explanations, and she had gone through all of them systematically, the way she had always approached problems in her life, methodically, without panic, one possibility at a time. By the second hour, she had stopped inventing explanations. The dress had been a mistake. She understood that now. She had put it on in Cheyenne that morning because she had wanted to arrive as a bride, because she had thought the gesture would be meaningful. that stepping off the train in her wedding dress would signal something about her intentions, her sincerity, her willingness to begin this new life properly. It had seemed important at the time. Now the dress was soaked through at the hem from the snow on the platform, and the cold had worked its way through the thin layers of satin and lace until she could no longer feel her feet properly, and the gesture seemed not meaningful, but foolish. Victor Ashford had written to her 3 months ago. She had been working as a seamstress in Cheyenne, a respectable trade, one she had learned from her mother, but difficult work that left her hands raw and her back aching and her income barely sufficient. Victor's letter had been formal and businesslike. He was a successful man, established in the territory, with a property outside Millhaven. He had heard of her through a mutual acquaintance. He was looking for a wife. The letter had included references, names of businessmen in Cheyenne who could vouch for his character and standing. She had been careful. She had checked those references. She had written back with questions, and he had answered them, and the correspondence had continued for 6 weeks before she had agreed to come. She was not naive. She had not come on a whim or out of desperation. She had done what a careful woman did. And still she was standing alone on an abandoned train platform in the snow in her wedding dress at 1:15 in the afternoon in November in Wyoming. The cold was beginning to frighten her. Not the cold itself. She had grown up in hard winters, and she understood cold. But what it was doing to her body, the way the shivering had become less violent in the last 20 minutes, which she knew was not a good sign. She had heard what happened when the cold stopped hurting. She had heard what came after. She needed to make a decision. She needed to move. She was trying to calculate whether she could walk to Millhaven. 6 miles, she thought, perhaps 7, when she heard the sound of a wagon coming off the road. Gideon brought the horses to a stop at the base of the platform steps and got down from the wagon without tying them off. The horses were reliable enough to stand. He went up the 3 steps to the platform and crossed it to where the woman was standing. Up close, the situation was worse than it had looked from the road. She was wearing a wedding dress that registered as so unlikely that for a moment his mind simply refused to process it. A wedding dress. In November. At an abandoned train station. The dress was ruined at the hem, soaked dark and heavy with snowmelt, and her lips had gone the pale bluish color that meant she had been out here too long. She was still upright, still conscious, but she was shaking in a way that looked less like shivering and more like her body was fighting to stay warm and losing. She was looking at him with dark eyes that were still sharp and aware. Whatever else the cold had taken from her, it hadn't taken her alertness. "How long have you been out here?" he said. "Since 11:15. Her voice was steady, but there was an effort behind it, a deliberateness that told him she was working to keep it that way. Gideon did the math. It was just past 1:30. 2 hours and change, he said. Approximately. He looked at her for a moment. The ruined dress, the lack of a proper coat, the single traveling case sitting beside her feet. And then he made the decision that he had more or less already made before he turned the wagon off the road. "My ranch is about 6 miles north," he said. "I've got heat and food, and I can get you to Millhaven tomorrow when the temperature comes up. You need to get out of this cold." She looked at him. He could see her thinking, evaluating, doing the same kind of calculation he had done on the road. Who is this person? What are the risks? What are my options? "I don't know you," she said. "No, my name is Gideon Hart. I ranch north of here, Hart Creek property. My daughter's in the wagon." He paused. "You're welcome to keep standing here if you prefer, but I'll be honest with you. You've got maybe another 30 minutes before this becomes a medical situation." Something shifted in her expression. Not fear exactly, more like a woman who had been braced against a wind and had just decided to stop fighting it. "Evelyn Reed," she said. "All right, Miss Reed, let's get you off this platform." Clara watched from the wagon as her father helped the woman down the steps. The woman moved carefully, like someone who wasn't entirely sure her legs were going to cooperate, and she was wearing the strangest dress Clara had ever seen, all white and lacy, with a long skirt that dragged in the snow, completely wrong for the weather. When they reached the wagon, the woman looked up and saw Clara watching her. "Hello," Clara said. "Hello?" The woman's voice was a little shaky, but her eyes were kind. "Your dress is wet," Clara observed. "I know." A small pause. "It was a mistake." "My mama had a pretty dress too," Clara said, "but she didn't wear it in the snow." There was a brief silence. Gideon had come around to the other side of the wagon and was doing something with a blanket from the storage box behind the seat, and the woman was looking at Clara with an expression that was hard to read, not quite sad, not quite something else. "That sounds very sensible of her," the woman said finally. "She died," Clara said, 2 winters ago. "Clara," Gideon said, not sharply, but with a note that meant that was enough of that particular subject. "I'm sorry," the woman said, and it didn't sound like the way people usually said it, the automatic sorry that adults offered when they didn't know what else to say. It sounded like she meant it. Gideon helped her up onto the wagon bench, wrapped the extra blanket around her shoulders, and climbed up on the other side. The woman was between them now, which put her out of the worst of the wind. Clara felt the coldness radiating off her. The dress, her hands, even through the blanket. She was very cold. Clara leaned against her slightly, instinctively, the way she sometimes leaned against her father's arm. The woman stiffened for just a moment, surprised, Clara thought, and then slowly relaxed. Gideon said nothing about it. He clicked to the horses and turned them back toward the road. The Hart Creek Ranch was not much to look at in winter. In spring and summer it was decent land, good grass, a reliable creek, the hills behind covered in pine and aspen. But November stripped all of that away and left the bones. The main house, solid but weathered, with a porch that needed new boards on the left end. The barn, larger than the house, dark and warm with animals. The smaller structures, the smokehouse, the root cellar, the tool shed, scattered around the yard in the way of things that had been placed for practical reasons over many years rather than for any plan. Gideon had built most of it himself over the years, adding and repairing as need and money allowed. The house was not fine, but it was tight against the wind and the roof was sound and the stove threw good heat. He had learned not to measure things against what they might have been. He measured them against what they needed to be. He got the woman, Evelyn Reed, inside and settled near the stove before he went back out to see to the horses. Clara stayed with her, which he noted but didn't comment on. His daughter had her mother's instincts about people, or at least he had always thought so. He had learned to pay attention when Clara took to someone. When he came back inside 40 minutes later, he found Evelyn sitting in the chair nearest the stove, wearing one of the old wool shirts he kept on a hook by the door. She must have asked Clara where it was, with her hair loosened and drying. The wedding dress was draped over the back of another chair, steaming slightly in the heat. Clara was at the table doing her afternoon lessons, but she was doing them with one eye on their guest. Evelyn looked up when he came in. The bluish color had left her lips. She looked better. Still tired, still hollowed out around the eyes, but better. "Thank you," she said, "for stopping." "You'd have been in trouble another hour," he said, moving to hang his coat. "I know." A pause. "Clara told me you're a widower." He didn't answer immediately. He poured water from the kettle into the basin and washed his hands. 2 years ago," he said. "I'm sorry. So am I." He dried his hands. "There's stew in the pot. It's been on since this morning, so it's probably past its best, but it'll do. I can help with supper." "You just came in from 2 hours in the cold in a wedding dress. Sit still." There was a sound from the table, Clara, stifling something that might have been a laugh. Evelyn glanced at her, and a small surprised smile crossed her face. Not a full smile, but the beginning of one. Os. They ate supper in the kitchen, the 3 of them around the table, and it was awkward in the way that meals with strangers are always awkward. The pauses that fall in the wrong places, the uncertainty about what subjects are permissible. Gideon was not a man who talked much, and the habit of silence that had settled over the ranch in the 2 years since Margaret's death made social conversation feel foreign and effortful. But Clara helped. She asked Evelyn where she had come from, and Evelyn said Cheyenne, and Clara asked what Cheyenne was like, and they had a conversation about the city that lasted through most of the meal. Gideon listened more than he spoke, watching Evelyn across the table. She was not what he would have expected if he had thought about it in advance, which he hadn't. She spoke directly, without the softening hedges that women were often expected to use in conversation. She had opinions and stated them without apology. When Clara said something funny, Evelyn laughed. Not politely, but genuinely, a real laugh that changed her whole face. She did not mention the man who had failed to meet her. She did not mention why she had been at Caldwell Station in a wedding dress. Gideon did not ask. Whatever had happened there was her business, and she would tell it or not tell it in her own time. After supper, when Clara had been sent to bed and the kitchen was quiet, Evelyn helped him wash the dishes without being asked. They stood side by side at the basin, him washing, her drying, and the silence between them was different now. Less awkward, more simply quiet. "You don't have to explain yourself," he said after a while. She glanced at him. "About why you were out there," he said. "It's your business." She was quiet for a moment, turning a plate over in her hands. "A man named Victor Ashford wrote to me," she said. "We had a correspondence. He proposed by letter. I came to marry him." A pause. "He wasn't there." Gideon nodded. "He sent someone to the station later," she said. "A man with a note. The note said he had reconsidered." She set the plate down carefully. "That's all. No explanation. Just, he had reconsidered. That's a poor way to treat a person." "Yes?" She picked up another dish. "It is." He could hear the effort in her voice, the deliberate control, the refusal to let the emotion into her words. He recognized it. He had used that same control himself for 2 years, keeping his grief in check through sheer stubbornness, because there were things that needed doing and a child who needed him present. "You can stay the night," he said. "I'll drive you to Millhaven tomorrow." She dried the last dish and set it on the shelf. "And then what?" she said, not bitterly. It sounded like a genuine question she was asking herself as much as him. He didn't have an answer for that. Neither did she. She stayed 3 days. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees the first night and made the road to Millhaven impassable for a wagon. Gideon told her this matter-of-factly the next morning, and she accepted it the same way, and they settled into a provisional arrangement that suited the circumstances. Evelyn was not idle. She was, Gideon noticed, constitutionally unable to be idle. By the second morning, she had taken over the kitchen, not by asking permission, but by simply doing it. She was up before him, the stove fed, coffee on, biscuits in the oven. She worked with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been managing a household since childhood, and the food she produced was considerably better than anything Gideon had made in the last 2 years. "You don't have to do all this," he told her on the second morning. "I'm aware," she said, not looking up from what she was doing. "I'm doing it because I want to, not because I feel obligated." He left it at that. Clara took to her with a speed that should have surprised him, but didn't. His daughter was ordinarily careful about new people. She watched and waited and made her own judgment slowly. But she had made her judgment about Evelyn on the wagon bench on the first afternoon. And by the second day they were sitting together at the kitchen table after lessons, and Evelyn was teaching her to do something with a needle and thread that involved a good deal of concentration on Clara's part, and a good deal of patience on Evelyn's. He came in from the barn one afternoon and found them like that, heads bent together over a piece of cloth, the kitchen warm and smelling of something baking, and the sound of Clara's voice asking a question and Evelyn's voice answering it, and something moved in his chest that he had not felt in a long time, something that was not grief, which was the most familiar feeling in that region of himself. He did not examine it. He went back outside. On the third night, after Clara was in bed, Evelyn found him on the porch. He was sitting on the steps, which was something he did sometimes in the evenings, just to be outside, in the cold and the quiet, away from the walls. The night was clear for the first time since the storm, and the stars were extraordinary, the way they got out here, where there were no town lights to compete with them. She came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat down on the step beside him and handed him one of the cups without asking if he wanted it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Probably. Why did you stop at the station?" He looked at the stars for a moment. "Because Clara pointed you out." "That's not the whole answer." "No." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "I suppose I stopped because I've done the calculation before, whether a thing is my business or not, and I know what I am when I walk past something I shouldn't have walked past." He paused. "I didn't want to be that." Evelyn was quiet for a while, looking out at the dark. The cold was sharp but not vicious, bearable if you were dressed for it, which they both were. "I'm trying to decide what to do next," she said. "That's reasonable. I have a little money, enough for a room for a month or 2 while I find work. There must be a seamstress's need in Millhaven." She said it like someone who was convincing herself as she spoke, laying out the facts, testing them. "There might be," he said honestly. Millhaven's got about 300 people. I don't know what work's available. I'll manage. He believed that she would. She was the kind of woman who would manage things. He had figured that out in 3 days, watching her, watching the way she moved through problems without flinching. Whatever had happened to her at Caldwell Station had hurt her. That was clear enough, in the careful control she kept over herself, in the moments when she thought no one was looking and something tired and wounded showed in her face, but it had not broken her. The road should be passable tomorrow, he said. All right. She finished her coffee. I'll be ready. She stood up and went back inside. He sat on the steps for a while longer, looking at the stars. In the morning, he drove her to Millhaven. Millhaven in winter was a town of about 300 souls who survived the cold through stubbornness and communal tolerance. It had 2 saloons, a general store, a livery, a dry goods operation, a barber, a small doctor's office, and a few other businesses that opened and closed depending on the season and the fortunes of their owners. It also had Mrs. Pruitt. Agnes Pruitt ran the only boarding house in town, a 2-story frame building on the main street that was clean and respectable and not cheap. She was a woman of 60 who had opinions about everything and kept them close to the surface, and she watched Gideon pull up with Evelyn Reed beside him on the wagon bench with an expression that already had conclusions forming in it. Mrs. Pruitt, Gideon said, pulling the horses to a stop. Gideon. Her eyes moved to Evelyn. Who's this? Evelyn Reed, Evelyn said before Gideon could speak. I'm looking for a room. Mrs. Pruitt looked at her with the particular attention of a woman who makes her living assessing the character of strangers. Where are you from? Cheyenne, most recently. Coming to meet someone? A small pause. That arrangement fell through, Evelyn said. Her voice was even. Mrs. Pruitt's expression shifted. A fractional softening, almost invisible. The kind of thing you had to be watching for. I've got a room on the 2nd floor. It's small. That'll do. The business of getting Evelyn settled took the better part of an hour. When it was done, Gideon found himself standing in the cold outside the boarding house with no particular reason to stay. Evelyn came out to see him off. She looked, he thought, somewhat diminished by the town backdrop. Smaller, more alone, standing on the wooden sidewalk in the wool coat he had found for her in the house, the one that had been Margaret's. He had given it to her without thinking that morning because her own coat was not warm enough, and he had seen it on the hook and just handed it to her. He hadn't thought about whose it was until later, driving to town, and by then it seemed wrong to take it back. Thank you, she said. For everything, the shelter, the food, a pause. The coat. Keep it, he said. It's no use to anyone hanging on a hook. She looked at him for a moment, that evaluating look he had seen at the station, careful and direct. Thank you, Mr. Hart. Gideon. Gideon. She held out her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm. He climbed up onto the wagon bench, turned the horses, and drove back toward the ranch. He didn't let himself look back. He was good at not looking back. He had been practicing it for 2 years. But Clara, sitting beside him, turned to look. He felt her do it. Will she be all right? Clara said. Probably. She's capable. Clara was quiet for a moment. I liked her. I know. She smells like Mama's coat. He didn't answer that. He kept his eyes on the road and his hands on the reins, and he drove the wagon north through the cold gray afternoon, away from Millhaven and toward the ranch that had been too quiet for 2 years. 3 weeks later, near the end of November, he drove back to Millhaven for supplies. He told himself he would stop at the boarding house simply to check, that it was a reasonable thing to do, to verify that she had settled in properly, that there were no complications. He had brought a stranger into his home during a snowstorm and discharged some basic human duty of care, and checking in on her once was not unreasonable. It was not anything else. He tied the horses in front of Dwyer's general store and was loading his wagon when he heard a voice behind him. You're blocking my line of sight to the window display. He turned. Evelyn Reed was standing on the sidewalk with a basket over her arm, looking at him with an expression that was somewhere between exasperated and amused. Miss Reed. It's fine, she said. I can see around you if I angle slightly. He had no idea what to say to that. He stood there for a moment holding a 20-pound sack of flour, feeling unusually at a loss. You're here for supplies, she said. Yes. How is Clara? She's well. She asks about you. He paused. Frequently. A small light moved through Evelyn's eyes. Does she? Every few days she mentions that she wonders how you're getting on. Her exact words. Most times. Evelyn almost smiled. Tell her I'm getting on fine. I found some work. Mrs. Dwyer needs someone to do alterations, and the hotel up the street needs curtains made before Christmas. It's not much, but it's enough to manage on for now. That's good. She looked at him steadily. He looked back. Would you want to come for supper? He said. The words came out before he had finished deciding to say them. Next Sunday. I'm making something. Clara would... She'd like to see you. A pause. He watched her think. All right, she said. Yes. Thank you. He nodded. He lifted the flour into the wagon. She adjusted her basket and walked on down the sidewalk toward whatever errand she'd had in mind. It was a simple exchange. That was all it was. He drove home through the early winter afternoon, and the road seemed shorter than usual, though of course it was exactly the same length it had always been. Sunday came and went, and then another Sunday, and by December the pattern had established itself without either of them quite deciding it. Evelyn came to the ranch on Sundays, sometimes staying for most of the day, and the house that had been silent and functional became, on those days, something else, something that had more noise in it, more movement, more of the quality that Gideon had stopped knowing how to name. Clara bloomed in it. There was no other word. She was a good child, steady and self-sufficient, the child of a man who needed her to manage herself because he was managing everything else. But she was still a child, and she had been living without a mother's attention for 2 years. And whatever Evelyn gave her on those Sundays, time, patience, attention, the simple fact of a woman who talked to her like her thoughts and observations mattered, it fed something in Clara that Gideon had not known was hungry. He watched it happen with a complicated feeling he did not have a name for. Evelyn was careful with him. That was the word he settled on. Careful. She did not presume. She came when she was invited, and she participated in the household when she was there without inserting herself in ways that weren't offered. She was interested in the ranch, the livestock, the winter management, the problems that came with running a property in this climate. And she asked good questions, practical ones, and she listened to the answers properly. They talked about things, not personal things, not grief or loss or the shape of the future, but things. The range conditions, the price of cattle, the reliability of the Millhaven assayer. She had opinions on all of it, formed opinions grounded in thought, and she was willing to argue for them when she thought she was right. He liked that. He had not realized until it was present how much he missed the particular pleasure of a real argument with someone whose intelligence he respected. He told himself it was friendship. That was the word he used internally when he caught himself thinking about Sunday before it arrived. That was probably not entirely accurate. The first hard blizzard of December came on a Wednesday night. Gideon had felt it coming for 2 days. The air had that particular quality it got before a real storm, still and heavy and oddly warm for a few hours before the temperature plunged. He had spent Tuesday getting in extra wood, checking the barn, securing the loose boards on the west side of the tool shed. He was ready. What he had not calculated for was Evelyn. She knocked on the door at 7:30 on Wednesday evening, which was not a Sunday, which was not usual. He opened the door and found her on the porch, with snow already thick in her hair and her breath coming hard from the walk. I didn't know where else to go, she said. The boarding house roof. Mrs. Pruitt thinks there's something wrong with it. There's ice working up under the shingles on the north side, and she's worried it'll come in. She's sending people to the Hendersons. They've got more room, but I couldn't... She stopped. I didn't want to be in the way over there. I thought, I'm sorry. I should have sent word. Get in here, he said. She got in. The storm came down properly around 9 o'clock, and by midnight it was the worst weather of the season. The wind was extraordinary. It got into the stovepipe and made sounds like something alive, and the house groaned in it, and even with the stove running at full heat, the temperature in the far corners of the rooms dropped enough to see breath. Clara had been asleep when Evelyn arrived, but woke in the night from the noise and came padding out to find Evelyn sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the lamp turned low. Is the roof going to come off? Clara asked. No, Evelyn said. It's been through worse than this. Your father built it right. How do you know? Because the wind hasn't found any gaps. When a roof is built poorly, you feel it. This one is holding. Clara appeared to find this satisfactory. She sat down at the table across from Evelyn and pulled the blanket she'd brought with her around her shoulders. Are you scared of the storm? She said. A little, Evelyn said honestly. When it gets loud, I'm a little scared, but it helps to be inside. I used to be more scared before. Clara picked at a loose thread on the blanket. Mama used to sit with me when the storms came. I just sat by myself. Papa would check on me, but he didn't sit with me very long because he had things to do. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. He was managing a lot, she said. I know. I wasn't mad. Clara looked up. It was just lonely. The words sat in the kitchen air between them, plain and accurate. I know about that, Evelyn said. They sat together until the worst of the storm passed, talking a little and quiet a little, and Gideon found them asleep at the kitchen table when he came in at 4 a.m. from checking the barn. Clara with her head on her folded arms, Evelyn with her head tilted back against the chair, both of them with the same expression, which was peaceful. He stood in the doorway looking at them for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he went and fed the stove and sat down in the third chair at the table and was quiet. In the morning, the storm had passed, and the land was white and absolute and silent, the way it gets after a big snow, hushed and immense, and somehow both beautiful and indifferent. Evelyn made breakfast while Gideon went to dig out the barn doors, and Clara helped her, and by the time Gideon came back inside, the kitchen smelled of bacon and coffee and something baked, and the table was set with actual care, cloth and all. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment, snow still on his coat, looking at the room. It looked like a home. That was the thing. It looked like an actual home, the way it had looked when Margaret was alive, warm and occupied and used by people who were living in it rather than just surviving in it. He had not let himself want that. He had been very careful about not letting himself want it. He sat down at the table. Evelyn set a plate in front of him and then sat down across from him, and Clara sat at the end, and they ate breakfast together in the morning light, and outside the snow lay perfect and undisturbed across the fields, and inside the kitchen was warm. He looked up and found Evelyn watching him with an expression he couldn't fully read. When she saw him notice, she looked down at her plate. The morning held still for just a moment around them, the way moments do sometimes, as if asking to be noticed. Gideon noticed it. He didn't say anything about it. He finished his coffee, pushed his chair back, and said he had to get the south fence checked before the drifts settled in. But he noticed it. The south fence had 2 posts heaved by the frost, which meant half a day's work in knee-deep snow with a bar and a mallet, and by the time Gideon got back to the house that afternoon, his hands were stiff inside his gloves, and his back had the particular ache that came from swinging a mallet in cold weather. He was not 30 anymore. He was 38, and the work reminded him of that fact with increasing regularity. Evelyn was still there. He had not expected that, had assumed, coming back up the slope toward the house, that she would have gathered her things and started the walk back to town once the roads were passable enough. But smoke was rising from the kitchen chimney, which it always did, and there was also smoke from the main room chimney, which he only lit when the cold warranted it, and when he came through the door he heard voices from the back of the house. He followed the sound and found Evelyn and Clara in the narrow room off the kitchen that had served for 2 years as a storage space for things Gideon didn't know what to do with. Margaret's sewing things, boxes of household items that had accumulated and never been sorted, 2 chairs with broken rungs stacked against the wall. They had opened the window to let in light and were going through one of the boxes, and Clara was holding up objects and asking questions, and Evelyn was answering them. What's this for? That's a hem gauge, for measuring fabric when you're doing alterations. Did my mama sew? A brief pause. Gideon stopped in the doorway. I don't know, Evelyn said. Some of these tools look well used, so probably. Do you know? Clara thought about it. She made me a dress once, a blue one. I don't know where it is now. Maybe it's in one of these boxes. Clara looked at the box with new attention. Maybe. Gideon cleared his throat. They both looked up. Evelyn read something in his expression. He wasn't sure what. He hadn't been trying to show anything. and she straightened up from the box. "I should have asked before going through these," she said. "I'm sorry. Clara said it was all right, but I should have checked with you." He looked at the room, the open boxes, the tools laid out on the floor. He looked at Clara, who was watching him with that careful attention she used when she wasn't sure how things were going to go. "It's fine," he said. "I should have sorted through this 2 years ago." He went and changed out of his wet things. Evelyn stayed through the afternoon and then through supper because it was already started by the time he came back, and it seemed foolish to stop. And after supper, the road to town was too dark and the temperature was back down, and it seemed equally foolish to send her out in it. So she stayed the night again, in the small room at the back of the house that had been, in some previous arrangement of the space, a guest room, though no guest had used it in years. She was back in Millhaven by Tuesday, but the Sunday visits had changed shape after that. They were longer now, less formal. She came earlier in the day and stayed into the evening, and the work of the day folded her in. She helped with things not because she was obligated to, but because the help was needed, and she was there, and that was how ranches worked. You did what needed doing. She had understood that early. By the 3rd week of December, she knew where everything was in the kitchen, and she and Clara had cleaned and reorganized the storage room into something usable again, and the broken chairs had been repaired. Gideon had done that one evening because Evelyn had mentioned that the joints looked like they only needed re-gluing, which was true, and it was the kind of practical observation he respected. The town noticed. Of course the town noticed. Millhaven was 300 people in winter, which meant that when a single woman started making regular trips to the ranch of a widower, people formed opinions quickly. He heard some of them from Will Tanner at the feed store, delivered with the awkward directness of a friend who felt obligated to pass along what was being said. "Agnes Pruitt is saying she sees you coming in Saturday evenings with your wagon," Will said, hefting a bag of oats. "People are wondering about the arrangement." "People can wonder," Gideon said. "I'm just telling you what's out there." "I appreciate it." Will set down the bag and looked at him. "Is she good people?" "Yes," Gideon said, without having to think about it. "That's what matters then." Will picked up the bag again. "Agnes Pruitt's been wondering about everybody's arrangement since 1871. She can keep wondering." Gideon hadn't told Evelyn about the talk. He wasn't sure it was his place to tell her. She would likely hear it herself, through Mrs. Pruitt or someone else in the boarding house. She was a perceptive woman. She probably already had heard it. He didn't know what he would say about it if she brought it up. He didn't know what the arrangement was. He hadn't named it, even to himself. She brought it up on a Sunday in the last week of December, after Clara had gone to look at something in the barn and they were alone in the kitchen. "I've been hearing things in town," she said. She was rolling pastry dough on the floured board with the same economic efficiency she applied to everything physical. "What kind of things?" "The kind where people have decided what this is." She didn't look up from the dough. "What I'm doing out here. What you're—" She paused, found the right words. "What you're allowing." He was quiet for a moment. "Does it bother you?" "That depends." She pressed the dough out with the heel of her hand. "What are you going to say if someone asks you directly?" It was a fair question. It deserved a straight answer, not a deflection. "I'm going to say that you're a friend of the family," he said, "and that it's nobody's business beyond that." She looked up then. She had flour on the back of her wrist from the rolling, and her hair had come partially loose from its pin on one side. She looked at him with that direct, evaluating look. "And is that what it is?" she said. "A friend of the family." He held her gaze. "I don't know what it is," he said. "I think that's honest." A pause. She looked back down at the dough. "That's fair," she said after a moment. "I don't know either." It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't even a beginning of a resolution. But it was honest, and between two people who had both been damaged by things that hadn't been honest, that mattered. Clara came back from the barn. They made pie. Christmas passed quietly. Gideon was not a man who made much of the holiday. He had kept it for Clara's sake since Margaret died, put up some pine branches and made a special meal and produced a gift. But the day was muted at the ranch, more absence than presence. Clara was old enough to feel that. She didn't complain about it, which was its own kind of statement. Evelyn joined them in the afternoon. She brought food, a proper Christmas pudding she had made at the boarding house, which impressed Clara enormously. and a small wrapped package for Clara, and something practical and quiet for Gideon, a pair of good leather gloves, nothing sentimental. "You wear through gloves," she said when he opened them. It was an observation, not an explanation. "I do," he said. Clara got Evelyn something too. A narrow braided bracelet she had made herself over the previous 2 weeks, with Gideon's help on the clasp, in colors she had picked out from a bin at the general store. Evelyn put it on at the table and wore it for the rest of the afternoon and didn't take it off when she left in the evening. Gideon noticed that. Yeah, January came in hard and stayed that way. The work of the winter ranch was relentless. Livestock to tend, fences to check, equipment to repair, fuel to manage. Gideon ran the operation alone, as he had been doing for 2 years, because hiring help in the winter months cost more than he could spare, and he had always managed to get through on his own, even if it meant long days and a kind of bone-deep tiredness that became his baseline state from November through March. Evelyn came on Sundays when the road allowed it, which was not every Sunday in January. Some weeks the weather kept her in town, and those Sundays at the ranch had a flat quality to them that Gideon noticed but did not comment on. Clara noticed it too. The 3rd week of January, Gideon got sick. It started as nothing, a tightness in the chest, the kind of thing that could be cold air or overexertion. He ignored it for 2 days, which was his standard approach to illness. If it could be ignored, ignore it. On the 3rd day, he woke up unable to draw a full breath without coughing, with a fever that made the room tilt slightly when he stood, and the tightness in his chest resolved itself into something that felt like a board pressed against his sternum. He got up and fed the stove and went out and fed the livestock, because they needed feeding. He came back in. He sat in the kitchen chair for 20 minutes before he trusted himself to stand again. Then he made coffee and told Clara, who had been watching him from the table with those dark eyes, that he was under the weather. "You look bad," Clara said. "I'm fine." "You don't look fine." "Clara, I'm just saying what's true." She pushed her oatmeal around her bowl. "Miss Evelyn says you should say what's true even when people don't want to hear it." He had no good response to that. He drank his coffee and went back out to check the south end of the property, which needed checking, and by mid-morning the cold had worked into his lungs in a way that made every breath an argument, and he came back to the house and sat down and did not get up again for the rest of the day. By evening his temperature was high enough that Clara was genuinely frightened. He could see it in her face. The careful control she was maintaining, the way she kept her voice steady when she checked on him, the way she sat close to the bed without saying much. She was her father's daughter. He was trying to calculate whether he could get to town, whether he was capable of harnessing the horses, whether the road was passable, when he heard the door. Evelyn had come. She told him later that she had felt uneasy on Sunday morning and had asked the liveryman to hitch her a ride out. She hadn't known anything was wrong, she said. She had just felt uneasy. He was never sure whether he believed that entirely or whether she said it to spare him the weight of having been a person who needed help. Either way, she was there. She assessed the situation quickly and without drama. She got Clara to bring extra blankets and stoke the stove as high as it would go. She made a mustard plaster, something she said her own mother had done for bad chest colds, and applied it with business-like efficiency that left no room for argument. She sent word to town for the doctor, though Dr. Ennis was 60 and slow in bad weather, and would likely not come until morning. She sat with Gideon through the first night, sleeping in the chair beside the bed in shifts, getting up whenever the fever spiked to put cold cloths on his forehead and get water into him. He was not an easy patient. He was the kind of sick man who kept trying to get up because there were things that needed doing, and she kept putting him back down with a firmness that he was too weak to effectively resist. "The horses," he said at some point in the night. "Fed. Clara and I did it. The water trough freezes overnight if you don't. I broke it this morning. It's fine. Stop talking and drink this." She held a cup to his mouth. He drank. The fever was bad enough that the room had a quality of unreality to it, the lamplight too bright and the shadows wrong, and he wasn't always certain how much time was passing. At some point he was aware of her voice, not what she was saying, but the fact of it, steady, low, reading something aloud from a book she had found. He didn't know how long she did that. He fell asleep to it. In the morning, the doctor came and said what Gideon already knew, which was that it was a bad chest infection and that he needed rest and warmth and liquids and that the plaster had been a good call. He left medicine and instructions and went back to town. Evelyn stayed. She stayed for 4 days without asking permission or explaining herself, managing the household and the livestock with Clara's help, maintaining the stove, making food that was designed to be easy on a sick man's system. She was not tender about it in any soft way. She didn't hover or fuss, but she was present, constantly and practically present, in the way of someone who has decided that a thing needs to be done and is simply doing it. On the 3rd day, when his fever had broken and he could sit up properly and the room had stopped tilting, he found her in the kitchen doorway, watching him eat soup with the expression of someone who has been managing a crisis and is only beginning to let themselves acknowledge it. "You didn't have to stay," he said. "No," she agreed. "Your work in town can wait a few days. Mrs. Dwyer's alterations are not an emergency." He looked at her. She was tired. He could see that now. The shadows under her eyes, the set of her shoulders that said she'd been running on will rather than rest. She had not slept properly in 4 days, managing a sick man and a 7-year-old and a ranch's basic needs in the dead of winter. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you." He said it plainly, without qualification. "I don't know what Clara would have done if you hadn't come." "Clara would have managed," Evelyn said. "She's your daughter." A pause. "But I'm glad I was here." There was something in her voice that was not quite controlled, a small unsteadiness, quickly recovered. She looked away, back into the kitchen. He recovered over the following week. Not all at once. That was the thing about a real illness. It didn't resolve cleanly. It retreated and held and retreated again. And he had 4 or 5 days of feeling almost himself, followed by a day of having nothing in reserve. His body's reminder that it had been genuinely taxed. He hated that. He hated the dependency of it. But he was functional by the end of January, and the ranch was in order. Better order than he had left it in before getting sick, actually, because Evelyn had found several things in the 4 days she managed it that needed attention and had either fixed them or made note of them for him. "The latch on the barn's east door is pulling away from the frame," she said, on the last evening before she went back to town. She had a small list which she handed him. "I couldn't do the re-nailing. I didn't know where you kept the long nails. And the roan mare's left front shoe is loose. I noticed she was favoring it on Tuesday." He looked at the list. It was specific and practical and entirely correct. He had been meaning to deal with the barn latch for 2 weeks. "Thank you," he said. "I wasn't trying to overstep," she said, with just enough care in her voice to tell him she was aware that it might have felt that way. "You didn't." He folded the list. "You helped." She was quiet for a moment. "It wasn't difficult. The ranch makes sense to me, the logic of it." She looked at him. "I like working things that have a clear logic. You can see what they need." "It's not usually this straightforward," he said. "Summers are harder, I imagine." She was doing something with her hands, folding a dish towel, refolding it. "I find myself thinking about it sometimes, how you manage the whole thing alone." "I manage." "You almost died last week." "I didn't almost die. It was a chest infection." "You were too sick to stand for 2 days." He didn't have an argument against that. He looked at her. "The offer," he said, then stopped. Started again. "When I brought you in from Caldwell Station, I said I'd get you to Millhaven. I did that. But if things in town aren't working the way you need them to," he was making a poor job of this. He tried again. "There's room here. If you wanted work that wasn't alterations in a boarding house room. The house needs more managing than I give it, and Clara needs—" He stopped. "That's not a good reason. Clara is my responsibility." Evelyn was watching him with an expression that he could not read with any confidence. "What are you asking?" she said. There was no sharpness in it. She genuinely wanted to know. "I'm not sure," he said, which was honest. "I'm asking whether you'd consider staying, whether there's something here whether it's better than what you have in town." He shook his head. "That's not well put." "No," she said, "it isn't." He looked at his hands. "But I understand what you mean," she said. A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. The silences between them had stopped being uncomfortable some time ago. This one was something else. The particular quiet of 2 people standing at a threshold and looking at it. Give me time to think, she said. Yes, of course. She went back to town the next morning. He watched the wagon go down the snow-packed road until it bent around the tree line and disappeared, then went to find the long nails and fix the barn latch, because it needed doing. She came back 2 weeks later with her trunk. She didn't make a large announcement of it. She drove out on a Thursday, not a Sunday, which was the thing that said most clearly that she was done making this a formal arrangement with formal visits. And when he came in from the morning's work, she was in the house, and her trunk was in the front room, and Clara was sitting on top of it. "Miss Evelyn's staying," Clara said. "I see that," Gideon said. Evelyn was standing in the kitchen doorway. She had the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is watching to see how it lands. "I spoke to Mrs. Pruitt," she said. "I've settled what I owed her. I've talked to Mrs. Dwyer about doing alterations from here. She agreed. I can pick up and drop off work when you go to town." She paused. "I'm not asking you to make this into something it isn't. I'm saying I'd rather be useful here than manage a boarding house room and 1 lamp and 6 feet of wall space." Another pause. "And Clara needs a more consistent—" She stopped herself. "I'll be honest. I want to be here. I think that's reason enough, if it's enough for you." He looked at her. He looked at Clara, who was watching him with those careful dark eyes over the top of the trunk. "It's enough," he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was just the truth of the moment, offered plainly. Evelyn gave a short nod, the kind that meant something had been settled. Clara slid off the trunk. "Can I show you where we're going to put this?" she said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "Show me." Gideon went to hang up his coat. He heard them in the back of the house, Clara's voice explaining something, Evelyn's voice responding. The house held both sounds with an ease that he noticed. He stood in the entryway for a moment, his coat in his hands, listening. Then he hung it up and went to wash for the midday meal. The weeks that followed Evelyn's arrival with her trunk were not seamless. That was the honest truth of it. 3 people rearranging themselves around each other in a space that had been shaped, for 2 years, by the habits of only 2. And the adjustment had friction in it, the way all real adjustments do. The first week was the hardest. It wasn't any one thing. It was the accumulation of small collisions. Gideon reaching for something in the kitchen and finding it had been moved. Not wrongly moved, just moved to a place that made more sense if you were the one doing the cooking, which was now Evelyn. It was Clara, who had grown used to a particular quiet in the evenings, suddenly having to negotiate the presence of another person's rhythms, another person's sounds, the way Evelyn hummed sometimes without seeming to know she was doing it while she worked. It was Gideon coming in from the barn one morning and finding Evelyn in conversation with the roan mare, not talking to her exactly, more talking near her, and the barn feeling briefly like a space he had walked into without being invited. He said nothing about any of it. He was a man who processed things internally, turned them over until he had decided what he thought, and only then said something if saying something seemed necessary. Most of what he was processing in those first weeks did not seem to require words. Evelyn had her own adjustments to make. He could see them if he was paying attention, which he was. She was careful in the way of someone who knows she is a guest in a place that has its own established order, even though she had chosen to come, even though she was not precisely a guest anymore. The category for what she was had not yet been established. She asked before she changed things. She asked where things were kept rather than searching until she found them. She was, he noticed, more tentative in this house than she had been during the Sunday visits, when the temporary nature of her presence had freed her to just do things without worrying whether the doing of them was overstepping. He mentioned this to her on the 5th day. "You don't have to ask about everything," he said. He was eating breakfast, and she had just asked whether it would be all right to rearrange the canned goods in the root cellar to get a better accounting of what was there. "You said you could see what the place needed, so see it." She looked at him across the table. "You're sure?" "I wouldn't have said it otherwise." She accepted that. By the end of the second week, the house had shifted, subtly, in ways that were practical rather than decorative, the kind of changes that come from someone who understands a working household rather than someone who wants to make it look different. The kitchen ran better. The root cellar was properly organized for the first time since Margaret died. The front room had its furniture moved 6 inches, which somehow made the whole space feel less cramped. Clara adjusted faster than either of them, which was perhaps unsurprising. Children are less invested in the way things have always been done. She had simply decided from the beginning that Evelyn's presence was a good thing, and she had arranged her interior world accordingly. What she had not arranged for, what none of them had arranged for, was the town. Tit. Millhaven's opinion of the arrangement at Hart Creek Ranch arrived in increments, the way opinions always do in small towns. A comment here, a look there, a shift in the quality of a conversation that tells you the people you're talking to have had another conversation about you recently. Gideon felt it at the feed store and the general store and the occasional visit to the saloon for a beer and information about range conditions from the other ranchers who used it for the same purpose. People were careful around him because he was not the kind of man who invited comments about his personal life, but careful was not the same as silent, and he was aware of what was circulating. The gist of it was this: an unmarried woman was living under the roof of a widower, and whatever the truth of the arrangement was, the appearance of it was one that people in a frontier town in 1887 had very specific feelings about. The more charitable version of the talk, which came from people who knew Gideon and had a reasonable opinion of his character, held that it was a practical arrangement, a housekeeper essentially, which was a thing that ranching households sometimes needed when there was no wife to manage them. The less charitable version, which came from people who didn't know him as well or simply had a disposition toward assuming the worst, was something else entirely. Agnes Pruitt, who felt some combination of concern and proprietary interest in Evelyn's situation, given that she had been her landlady for 2 months, took it upon herself to say something directly. She came out to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon in early February, which required borrowing a horse and riding 3 miles in cold that wasn't quite brutal but wasn't comfortable either, which told Gideon how seriously she was taking the matter. He was in the barn when she arrived. Evelyn was in the house. Clara was at the table with her lessons. He watched Agnes Pruitt ride into the yard and dismount with the careful efficiency of a woman who is no longer young but refuses to acknowledge it, and he came out of the barn to meet her. "Agnes," he said. "Gideon, I need to speak with Evelyn." "You can speak with her." "I'd rather do it privately." He looked at her. Agnes Pruitt was a difficult woman in some ways, but she was not a malicious one. She had run a clean and respectable boarding house for 20 years, which told you something about her standards, and she had given Evelyn a decent room and a fair price, which told you something about her fairness. "She's in the house," he said. "I'll stay out here." Agnes went in. Agnes. He found out later from Evelyn what had been said. Agnes had sat down at the kitchen table and had a cup of coffee and had said, with the directness that was her way, that people were talking and that she was concerned about Evelyn's reputation, and that if there was nothing between them of a formal nature, then the arrangement was going to cost Evelyn her standing in the community, which was a hard thing to build and an easy thing to lose. Evelyn had listened to all of this, and then she had said, equally directly, that she appreciated the concern and that she had thought about it herself, and that she had made the decision with open eyes, and that she had learned something about the cost of basing her choices on what other people thought was appropriate. Agnes had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "You're a stubborn woman." "Yes," Evelyn had said, "I am." Agnes had finished her coffee and ridden back to town. When Evelyn told Gideon this later that evening, she said it without heat and without particular distress. She said it the way she said most things, factually, with the emotion underneath rather than on top. "She's not wrong about what people are saying," Gideon said. "I know. It'll affect you more than me." He meant this honestly, not defensively. It was simply true that in 1887 Wyoming, the social consequences of an arrangement like this landed more heavily on the woman. "I know that too." She was sitting across from him at the kitchen table, Clara long since in bed. The lamp was between them. "I've spent a good portion of my life worrying about what my situation looked like from the outside," she said. "Where it got me was standing on a train platform in a wedding dress in November." She picked up her coffee cup. "I'm done letting that be the deciding factor." He looked at her. "I'm not saying I don't care at all," she said before he could respond. "I'm saying I've recalibrated what it's worth. Against other things." He nodded slowly. "Against what it's worth to be here." "Yes." She met his eyes. "If that's not too presumptuous to say." "It's not," he said. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the February wind moved across the land with its usual indifference to human concerns. February deepened, and the ranch settled into the rhythms of the hard middle of winter. There was a particular quality to February on the high plains, a grayness that was different from November's gray, more worn, more intimate, as if the cold had been going on long enough that it had stopped being an event and become simply the condition of the world. The days were still short, the work was still constant, but there was a different quality of endurance to it now. Not the bracing yourself of early winter, but the steady, practiced patience of people who know the season will turn and are simply waiting it out. Gideon found that he was no longer waiting it out alone in the way that he had been. That was the simplest way to describe what had changed. The cold and the work and the long evenings were the same, but they were shared now, and sharing changed them in ways he had not anticipated. He noticed it in small moments. Coming in at the end of a hard day's work and finding the house warm and supper already going, and the specific quality of relief that produced, not just the practical relief of warmth and food, but something else, something that had to do with not coming back to an empty room. Sitting at the table in the evenings, Evelyn on one side with her mending work from Mrs. Dwyer, Clara on the other with a book, the stove ticking with heat, and recognizing that this particular configuration of people and light and warmth was something he wanted to preserve. He was not, by nature, a man who talked about what he was feeling. He had been raised in a tradition, his father's tradition, the frontier's tradition, that treated emotional expression as a kind of indulgence, something that distracted from the necessary work. He had carried that with him into his marriage, and Margaret had mostly worked around it, had found the places where his reticence opened slightly, and had spoken into those places with patience. He missed that. He had missed it for 2 years without ever exactly putting words to what was missing. Evelyn did not work around his reticence in the same way. She was more direct. She said things plainly, and she expected him to say things plainly, and when he didn't, she waited. She didn't push, but she waited with a quality of attention that made silence feel like something that needed to be filled. This produced gradually a different kind of conversation between them, not more sentimental. Neither of them had much use for sentimentality, but more honest, more willing to get close to the things that were actually being felt. "Do you miss her?" Evelyn asked him one evening in the middle of February. He knew who she meant. "Yes," he said. "Not the way I did the first year. It's changed shape." How? He thought about it. The first year, it was something that came at you, grief like that. It surprises you. You'll be doing something ordinary and it hits you. The second year, it started to feel more like something you carry. You know it's there. You don't keep being surprised by it. And now? Now it's part of the weight, he said, part of what I'm carrying. But weight is just weight. You learn to walk with it. She was quiet, looking at her mending. "I think about the man I almost married sometimes," she said after a while. "Not with longing, just I think about what I thought he was, and what he turned out to be, and what that says about my judgment." A pause. "That's a harder thing to carry than grief, I think. Grief is clean. It doesn't make you doubt yourself." "Your judgment's sound," he said. She looked at him. "You've known me 4 months. I've watched you manage a ranch through the worst of winter while I was flat on my back. I've watched you with Clara. I've watched you decide things." He looked back at the stove. "Your judgment is sound." She didn't respond to that directly, but she did not look away as quickly as she might have. The first real sign of spring, and in Wyoming, the first real sign of spring is less a warm day than a slightly less cold one, a softening at the edges of the cold, a light that shifts so subtly you can't be sure whether you're imagining it, came in early March. By then, the ranch had an established order, and Evelyn was at the center of it. Not in the way of someone who had taken over or displaced what had been there before, but in the way of someone who had found the load-bearing points of a structure and put their shoulder against them. The house was running better. Clara was doing better. Gideon was... He didn't have a word for it. More himself, perhaps. More like the person he had been before grief narrowed him down. He had not said any of this to Evelyn. He was working toward it, in the way of a man who is constitutionally cautious, and who had been burned by the assumption that things would work out the way he wanted them to. He was not going to say something until he was sure what he was saying. He was not going to complicate an arrangement that was working, that was good for Clara, that was, he thought, good for Evelyn too, by saying something prematurely and making it strange. He was still in this cautious internal state when Victor Ashford rode into the yard on the third Monday of March. Gideon was splitting wood on the east side of the house when he heard the horse. He straightened and looked. The man on the horse was not anyone he recognized. He was perhaps 40, well-dressed for a man riding out to a ranch in mud season. A good coat, a hat that hadn't seen much rough weather, boots that were more suited to a boardroom than a yard. He rode a horse that cost more than most of Gideon's livestock. He had the posture of a man who was accustomed to arriving places and having people respond accordingly. He pulled up in the yard and looked down at Gideon with an expression of careful assessment. "I'm looking for a woman named Evelyn Reed," he said. "I was told she's staying here." Gideon rested the splitting axe against his leg. "Who's asking?" "Victor Ashford. She and I had an arrangement." The name landed with a specific weight. Gideon had heard it once, from Evelyn, on the first night he had brought her in. The man who had left her at Caldwell Station with a note delivered by someone else. He had not thought much about Victor Ashford since then, partly because there hadn't seemed to be reason to, and partly because he had a habit of not spending time on things he couldn't do anything about. He looked at the man on the horse. "She lives here," Gideon said. "I'll see if she wants to speak with you." He went inside. Evelyn was in the kitchen. She looked up when he came in, read something in his face. "What is it?" "Man in the yard," Gideon said. "Says his name is Victor Ashford." The change in her face was immediate and complex. A flash of something that was fear and something else, something harder. And then a deliberate settling, like a person finding their footing on uncertain ground. "He's here," she said. Not a question. "Yes." She set down what she was holding. She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her doing what she always did, processing, measuring, deciding. "All right," she said. "You don't have to talk to him." "No?" She looked at him directly. "But I think I should." She went to the door. He followed her, not because she needed him to, but because it was his yard. Victor Ashford dismounted when Evelyn appeared. He had the social graces of a man who had spent money on acquiring them. He took off his hat. He arranged his expression into something that was meant to suggest either remorse or reasonable concern. It was difficult to tell which. "Evelyn," he said. "Mr. Ashford." Her voice was level. "I've been looking for you." He glanced at Gideon briefly, the way men look at things that are in their way. "I'd like to speak with you privately. Whatever you have to say, you can say here." Something moved across his face, displeasure, quickly managed. "I don't think that's wise, given the nature of—" "Say what you came to say," Evelyn said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he adjusted, the way people do when they realize the approach they planned isn't going to work. "I made a mistake," he said. "In November. I acted hastily and I handled the matter badly, and I've regretted it." He was looking at her with what might have been sincerity. It was hard to read from the outside. "I'd like to talk about whether there's still a possibility, whether we could—" "No?" Evelyn said. He blinked. He had not expected the word to come that fast. "Evelyn, we corresponded for 6 weeks," she said. "I came 140 miles. You sent someone else to tell me you'd changed your mind. You left me at an abandoned station in November with no shelter and no transport and no explanation." She was not raised, her voice. She was extraordinarily calm. "There's nothing to discuss." His expression shifted. The reasonable remorse arrangement on his face gave way to something with more edge to it. "You're being hasty," he said. "I understand you're angry." "I'm not angry," she said, and she sounded like she meant it. "I'm just not interested." Victor Ashford looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at Gideon, and then he looked around the yard. The modest house, the weathered barn, the muddy March ground, and something settled into his face that was not pleasant. "You're living here," he said, "with this man." The word "this" had a particular quality to it, without being married. "My living arrangements aren't your concern." "They are, in fact," he said, and now his voice had changed too. The reasonableness had gone and something harder had come into its place, the tone of a man who is accustomed to leverage. "I have considerable standing in this territory. Business connections, social connections. A word from me about the nature of this arrangement," he gestured at the house vaguely, "could do real damage to both of you, to your standing in this community, to the Hart name." He paused. And to your prospects of ever being received respectably anywhere in this territory again. Gideon had been quiet throughout this exchange. He had watched it with the particular attention he gave to things that required him to think before he acted. He was not a man who moved quickly on anger. He had learned that quick anger in bad situations produced worse situations. But he was angry now. He could feel it, the cold, specific kind, the kind that didn't make him loud or reckless, the kind that made him precise. You rode 3 miles out from town, he said, to threaten a woman who doesn't want to talk to you. Victor looked at him. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm being honest about... You're being honest. Gideon set the axe down against the woodpile. He did not do it threateningly. He did it carefully, deliberately. You left a woman alone in November weather with nothing, and now you've ridden out here to tell her that if she doesn't come back to you, you'll ruin her. That's what you're here to do. Victor's jaw tightened. You don't know anything about the situation between... I know what she told me, Gideon said, and I know what I'm looking at right now. He held Victor's gaze steadily. Get off my property. The two men looked at each other. Victor Ashford was not physically intimidated. He had the height and the build of a man who had played at respectability long enough to stop thinking about the physical world as something that operated on him. But there was something in Gideon's stillness, the particular quality of it, that told a different story than the story Victor was used to reading. This isn't over, Victor said. It is for today, Gideon said. Go on. Victor looked at Evelyn one more time. A long look, calculating, the look of a man revising his strategy rather than abandoning it. Then he put his hat on, mounted his horse, and rode out of the yard without another word. They stood there until the sound of hooves faded. Then Evelyn let out a breath. Just one, just slow, the kind that says a body has been held tighter than it knew. He'll do what he said, she said. He'll talk. I know. The things people already wonder about. He'll give them more to say. She was looking at the gate where Victor had gone through. Your name along with mine. I'm aware. She turned to look at him. Her face was careful, controlled, but underneath the control he could see something that was not quite fear, more like the particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent years having her choices complicated by other people's power over her story. I'm sorry, she said, for bringing this to your door. You didn't bring it, he said. He wrote it in. Gideon, don't apologize for him. He said it gently, but without room for argument. He made a choice to come here. You didn't. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked away. He could see her thinking, doing the calculations she always did. What this meant, what it would cost, what the options were. I'll need to think about what to do, she said. Yes, he said. So will I. Clara had been inside during all of it. She came out now, appearing in the doorway with the expression of a child who had been listening and was deciding how much to reveal about that. Was that the man who didn't come to the station? She said. Evelyn looked at her. Where did you hear about that? I asked Papa once, after the first night. He said a man was supposed to meet you and didn't. She looked between them. Was that him? Yes, Evelyn said. Clara considered this. He didn't seem very sorry, she said. No, Evelyn agreed. He didn't. Clara went back inside. That evening, after supper, after Clara was asleep, they sat at the kitchen table and talked about it properly. It was not an easy conversation. Victor Ashford had connections in Millhaven and beyond. Business dealings with the bank, a relationship with the territorial representative in Cheyenne, a social network that extended further than a working rancher's did. His version of events, delivered to the right people, would have weight behind it simply because of who he was. That was the reality of it, and Evelyn laid it out plainly because she did not have the habit of softening things that needed to be looked at clearly. He'll say that I came here willingly, without a formal arrangement, she said. He'll say it in a way that implies what he wants it to imply. He probably will, Gideon said. And some people will believe it, not because they're bad people, but because it's the version that fits what they already suspect. She looked at her hands on the table. I've managed before with people thinking poorly of me. I can manage it again. You shouldn't have to. A lot of things I've had to deal with, I shouldn't have had to. She said it without bitterness. That doesn't change that they happened. He was quiet for a moment. He was turning something over, something he had been moving toward for weeks and had told himself he wasn't ready for. He was asking himself, honestly, whether what he was about to say was something he was saying because of Victor Ashford's arrival, or whether it was something he had already been moving toward and Victor's arrival had simply accelerated. He decided it was the latter, and he decided that the timing, awkward and complicated as it was, didn't change whether it was true. "There's something I could do," he said slowly, "that would address the problem." He paused. "And that I would want to do regardless of the problem, if I thought you were willing." He looked at her. "I'm not saying this because of what he threatened. I want to be clear about that." Evelyn was watching him with great care. "I'm saying it because it's what I want," he said, "and because I believe it might be what you want, but I'm not certain, and I don't want to assume." He stopped. "I'm making a poor job of this." "No," she said quietly. "Go on. Marry me," he said, "not to solve a problem, because I want you here properly as mine, as my wife, as Clara's." He stopped on that one because Clara was a complicated piece of it, not complicated in a bad way, but in a way that mattered and deserved respect. "I want to build this into something real, if you want that too." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn looked at him for a long time, that measuring, careful look she had given him at the station on the first day, the look that meant she was thinking and was going to think completely before she spoke. "You mean it," she said finally. Not a question, but she needed to hear his answer anyway. "Yes." "Not because of him." "Not because of him." She looked at the table. Then she looked back at him. "The last time I was going to marry someone," she said, "I had 6 weeks of correspondence and a set of references and 140 miles of train travel, and it turned out to be nothing. You're asking me on a kitchen table in March because a man rode into the yard and threatened to make trouble." A pause. "I know you said that's not why. I believe you, but you can see why I'm being careful." "I can," he said. "Take whatever time you need." She shook her head slowly. "I don't need time," she said. "I've known the answer for a while. I just didn't know the question was on the table." He waited. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you." He let out a breath he had not known he was holding. She was watching him with an expression that was not quite a smile, something more careful than that, something that knew the territory ahead was not going to be simple or easy, because nothing between two real people with history and damage and hard habits ever was. But it was something. It was something real, and it was chosen, and it was not built on 6 weeks of letters and other people's references. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held it. Outside, March was doing what March always did, pushing against the edges of winter, not winning yet, just insisting. The creek would start to loosen soon. The ground would soften. The season was going to change whether anyone was ready for it or not. Inside the kitchen, the lamp burned steady, and the two of them sat at the table holding onto each other's hands and being very quiet, in the way of people who have just said something that cannot be taken back and have decided they do not want to take it back. In the morning, Clara came to breakfast and found them already at the table together, and she looked at both of their faces with those dark, observant eyes, and she said, "Something happened." "Yes," Gideon said. "What?" He looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at him. "We're going to be married," Gideon said. Clara sat down. She absorbed this with the deliberateness she brought to all important information. Then she looked at Evelyn. "Are you going to stay?" she said. "After? Actually stay?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "I'm going to stay." Clara nodded, once, with the gravity of a child who has been given exactly the answer she was hoping for, and is trying not to show too much of how much it matters. "All right," she said. She picked up her fork. "What's for breakfast?" Gideon made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Evelyn did laugh, that real laugh that changed her whole face. The morning held them in it, ordinary and complicated and theirs. Victor Ashford was still out there. The town was still talking. The road ahead had real obstacles in it, and they both knew that. But the kitchen was warm, and the three of them were at the table, and for the moment that was what was real and immediate and worth holding on to. Victor Ashford did not waste time. By Tuesday, 2 days after he had ridden out of the Hart Creek yard, the talk in Millhaven had taken on a different quality. Gideon felt it on his next trip to town, a Thursday, when he went in for flour and wire and a few other things that couldn't wait. The shift was subtle enough that a less attentive man might have missed it, but Gideon had been reading the temperature of rooms since he was a boy, and he read this one accurately. The conversations at the general store that stopped a beat too early when he came through the door. The way Tom Dwyer's wife found something to do in the back of the shop, rather than come out and say hello the way she usually did. Will Tanner at the feed store, who was a straight-talking man and a genuine friend, who met Gideon's eyes and then said, carefully, that there was some talk going around. "What kind?" Gideon said. "The kind that comes from a man with money who wants to make a point." Will moved a bag of grain from one stack to another without any real purpose to it. Ashford's been at the bank and at the hotel and had dinner at the Cattleman's on Tuesday night. Apparently he knows Judge Harlan from Cheyenne. They served on some territorial committee together. He's been mentioning your name and Evelyn's. Saying what? Saying she was his intended and that she left him for another situation. Will set the grain bag down and looked at him, making it sound like she came here on purpose, like it was planned. It wasn't. I know that. You know that. People who know you know that. Will paused. People who don't know you are listening to a well-dressed man with connections who talks smooth. Gideon stood there for a moment, his list in his hand, looking at the grain bags. "He say anything about the ranch?" he said. Not directly, but he had a long conversation with Mercer at the bank. Will said it quietly. "I heard it from Pete Alcott, who was there getting his own business done. Apparently Ashford was asking questions about the Hart Creek note." Gideon's jaw tightened. He had a small loan against the ranch, not large, taken out 2 years ago to get through the first winter after Margaret died, when the cattle loss had been bad and the cash position had been worse. He had been paying it down steadily. It was not a problem. It had not been a problem. Whether it could be made into one by the right man asking the right questions of the right banker was a different calculation. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "Watch yourself," Will said. "That's all." Thank. He told Evelyn that evening. He told her plainly, the way she always told him things, without softening the edges. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and he watched her process it, not with panic, but with the particular stillness of a person who is measuring something carefully before deciding how to respond. "The bank note," she said, "it's manageable. It's not large. But if someone with connections wanted to make it complicated, it could be made complicated," he said. "Yes." She looked at the table. Clara was in the other room doing her evening reading, and they were keeping their voices below the level that would carry. "He's trying to get leverage," Evelyn said. "On both of us. He wants me to come back to him, and he thinks if he makes the alternative costly enough." She stopped. "He's not wrong that it will cost you. That's the part I keep coming back to, what this costs you." "Evelyn, let me say it," she said. "I came here with nothing. I came with a ruined dress and a traveling case and a situation that was already a problem for your reputation. I don't regret any of it, but you had a working ranch and a standing in this community, and you didn't have any quarrel with anyone before I walked through your door." She looked at him. "He's going to use me to get to you, and I can't pretend I'm comfortable sitting here while that happens." "What are you saying?" he said, and there was an edge in his voice, not at her, but at the situation. "That you want to go back to him?" "No." The word was immediate and flat. "I will never go back to that man. I want to be very clear about that." "Then what?" "I'm saying I'm angry," she said, and for the first time he heard the heat under the controlled surface, the actual anger she had been managing. "I'm angry that he can do this. I'm angry that a man who left me in the snow with a note delivered by someone else gets to ride into your yard and make threats, and people listen to him because he has money and connections. And I'm angry that my being here puts you in a position that you shouldn't have to be in." He was quiet. "I'm not telling you something you don't already know," she said. "I'm not asking you to fix it. I just need to say it." "All right," he said. "Say it." She did. Not at length. She was not a woman who spoke at length about her feelings. She was like him in that. She said what needed saying and stopped. But she said it, The anger and the helplessness and the specific indignity of having made careful choices and still ended up in the power of someone who had treated her as a transaction. When she finished, he said, "I've been thinking about when." She looked at him. "We said we'd marry," he said. "We haven't set a time. I've been thinking we shouldn't wait." The silence stretched between them. "Because of him," she said. "Partly because of him," he said. "He's given us a reason to move faster. But I told you on the night I asked you that it wasn't because of him, and that's still true. We were going to do this. We're going to do it sooner. That's all he's done, but moved the schedule." She held his gaze for a long time. "People will say we did it because he threatened us," she said. "Some will," he agreed. "Some will understand the difference. And honestly," he paused, "I find I care less about what people say than I would have told you I did 4 months ago." Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile, not exactly, but the edge of one. "That's a change." "You're a bad influence," he said. She did smile then, briefly, and it was the real one. "All right," she said. "On when?" "Saturday," he said, "if Harding's available." Owen Harding was the Justice of the Peace in Millhaven, a practical man who had been performing civil marriages in the territory for 15 years. "I'll ride in tomorrow and ask him." Evelyn straightened in her chair, and he watched her settle into the decision the way she settled into all decisions. Fully, without reservation, the way you commit your weight to a step once you've decided to take it. "Saturday," she said. He rode to Millhaven on Friday morning and found Owen Harding at his office above the dry goods store. Harding was a thin man in his 50s with reading glasses. He was perpetually pushing up his nose in a manner that was businesslike without being cold. He had known Gideon for years, not intimately, but the way men know each other in small frontier towns, through accumulated transactions and occasional conversations over the course of a long acquaintance. Harding looked at him over the reading glasses when he came in. "Gideon," he said, "what can I do for you?" "I need a marriage ceremony," Gideon said. "Tomorrow, if you're available." Harding looked at him for a moment. "You and the Reed woman?" "Yes." Harding nodded slowly, the way a man nods when information he has been receiving in pieces finally assembles itself into a coherent picture. "I've heard some things this week," he said. "I imagine you have." "Victor Ashford had a drink with Judge Harlan's clerk on Wednesday," Harding said, without inflection. "The clerk told half the town." "What did Ashford say?" "That the woman had been his intended and had taken up with a rancher." Harding removed his glasses and polished them with a cloth. He made some implications. Nothing actionable, just implications. "And what does the town think of the implications?" Harding put the glasses back on and looked at him steadily. "The town thinks various things," he said. "People who know you think he's full of hot air. People who don't know you are less sure. People who do business with Ashford are being careful." A pause. "And Agnes Pruitt told everyone at the Thursday sewing circle that you're the most decent man in the territory and that Ashford is a coward who abandoned a woman in a blizzard, which, coming from Agnes, carries considerable weight." Gideon had not known about Agnes Pruitt and the sewing circle. He filed it away. "Can you do it tomorrow?" he said. 10 o'clock, Harding said. "My office. Bring 2 witnesses." He went to Will Tanner first, who said yes before Gideon finished asking. Then he went to Agnes Pruitt, which he had not originally planned, but which seemed, given what Harding had told him, like the right thing to do. Agnes Pruitt opened her door and looked at him. "I heard about the sewing circle," he said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was carefully neutral. "I said what was true," she said. "I don't apologize for saying what's true. I'm not asking you to." He paused. "I'm asking if you'd be a witness at a wedding, tomorrow at 10. Agnes was quiet for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I'll put water on." He sat in Agnes Pruitt's front room for 20 minutes and drank tea and was subjected to a conversation that covered, without apparent order, her opinions on Victor Ashford's character, her assessment of Evelyn Reed's courage, her views on the proper way for a man in Gideon's position to handle a situation like this one, and several observations about what Margaret Hart would have thought of the whole business. The last delivered with the bluntness of a woman who had known Margaret and felt entitled to invoke her. "She would have liked Evelyn," Agnes said finally. "Different women, but the same underneath. The kind that holds. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. "I'll be there at 10, Agnes said. "Tell the girl to wear something decent, not a wedding dress." "I'll tell her." He said. He got back to the ranch in the late afternoon and found Evelyn in the yard splitting kindling, which was technically his job, but which she had apparently decided needed doing. She looked up when he came through the gate. "Well?" she said. 10 o'clock tomorrow. Harding's office. Will Tanner and Agnes Pruitt are witnessing. She set the axe down. Agnes Pruitt. She called Ashford a coward at the Thursday sewing circle. Evelyn stared at him. "She also said you had courage," he said, "and that Margaret would have liked you." The expression that crossed Evelyn's face was complex and brief. She picked up the axe again and split a piece of kindling with a clean stroke. "All right," she said. 10 o'clock. Clara, who had been sitting on the porch steps with a book, said, "Am I coming?" "Yes," both of them said at the same time. Clara looked between them and then went back to her book with the expression of a child who has received the expected answer and can now move on. The morning of the wedding was a Saturday in late March that came in cold but clear, which was about as much as you could ask of late March in Wyoming. The sky was pale blue, and the snow was still on the ground, but the mud season had started in earnest, which meant the road to town was uncertain, and the yard was a disaster, and everyone who went anywhere that morning arrived with mud on them to varying degrees. Gideon wore his best coat, which was not exceptional, but was clean and well kept. Evelyn wore a dark green wool dress that was the best thing she owned. Not a wedding dress, not anything designed for the occasion, just a good dress that fit her well and made her look like herself. Clara wore her second best dress, and her good boots, and her hair braided back the way Evelyn had taught her, and she sat very straight on the wagon bench on the drive to town. They arrived at Harding's office at 10:05. Will Tanner was already there, standing on the sidewalk with his hat in his hands. Agnes Pruitt was there too, and she was not alone. Standing with her were 4 other women from the Thursday sewing circle, who had apparently decided to come without being asked. Behind them were 2 of the ranchers from the properties north of Millhaven, who had heard from Will, and Tom Alcott from the livery, and Harding's own wife, who had come downstairs from their apartments to see what the gathering was about. It was not the crowd that any of them had planned for. It was just the people who had decided to show up. Evelyn stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the assembled group, and something crossed her face that she covered quickly. He was close enough to see it, the catch of it, the effort. "They just came," Will said, with a slight apologetic shrug. "Word got around." Agnes Pruitt stepped forward and looked at Evelyn with the expression of a woman who does not do sentiment but has made a specific accommodation for this occasion. "You look sensible," she said. "Good," Evelyn laughed, that real laugh. "Thank you, Mrs. Pruitt." They went up the stairs to Harding's office. The ceremony was short. Harding performed civil marriages with the same efficient directness he brought to all his official functions. The words were the legal words, the questions were the required questions, and he had a manner that managed to be both formal and human at the same time, which was harder than it sounded. Gideon stood beside Evelyn in the small office with the clear March light coming through the windows and said the words when they were asked of him. He meant them. He had not said things he didn't mean in a long time, and he was not going to start now. Evelyn said them too, in a voice that was steady and clear. When it was done, Harding shook Gideon's hand and nodded to Evelyn and said, with the small warmth he permitted himself, "That'll do." Clara, who had been standing slightly behind them throughout, stepped forward and took Evelyn's hand. Not dramatically, just took it. Evelyn looked down at her. Clara was looking straight ahead, composed, her hand tight around Evelyn's. They went back downstairs. On the sidewalk, with the witnesses and the unexpected gathering around them, Victor Ashford appeared. He came down the main street from the direction of the hotel, on foot, and he stopped when he saw the group outside Harding's office. He had not known, Gideon was certain of that from the expression on his face, the brief unguarded moment before he managed it. He had not known this was happening this morning. He stood on the street and looked at them, the gathered people, the ranchers, the sewing circle women, Will Tanner, Tom Alcott, looked back at him. Not aggressively, not with a crowd's menace, just Looked. The way a community looks at someone who has been putting pressure on people it has decided to support. Victor looked at Evelyn. She met his gaze without moving and without looking away. He was a man who understood social situations, who was skilled at reading a room, and what he was reading right now was not in his favor. He had calculated that a quiet marriage in a justice of the peace's office would have a diminished effect on the situation, that Evelyn would come to him as a practical matter, or that if she didn't, the talk he had been generating would be enough to damage Gideon's position with the bank and the territory's social network. He had not calculated for Agnes Pruitt's sewing circle. He had not calculated for Will Tanner making calls. He had not calculated for the particular solidarity of a small frontier town when it decided to make a decision about someone. He looked at Gideon. Gideon looked back at him with the same steady expression he had used in the yard 3 days ago. No heat, no performance, just presence. Ashford, Gideon said, because it seemed like the thing to acknowledge. Victor said nothing for a moment. He was doing his calculations. Gideon could see it. The rapid, experienced assessment of a man who has played social situations like a hand of cards and is currently looking at a table that has gone against him. "Congratulations," Victor said finally. His voice was even. "You had to hand it to him. His control was good. I hope you'll be very happy." The words were correct. The tone was as correct as he could make it. There was nothing in it to object to, on the surface. He turned and walked back the way he had come. The group on the sidewalk watched him go. Agnes Pruitt said quietly, but not quietly enough, "Good riddance to poor goods." Several of the sewing circle women appeared to be suppressing various responses to this. Will Tanner came over and shook Gideon's hand. "Congratulations," he said, and his version of the word meant something entirely different from Victor Ashford's. Yes, they had dinner at the hotel that afternoon. Not a celebration exactly, more a gathering that happened to involve food. Harding and his wife came, and Will and Agnes and the other witnesses, and a few of the ranchers who had been outside and had been invited without any particular formality. The hotel's cook made a decent meal, and there was pie, and it was loud in the way that genuine gatherings are loud. Multiple conversations going at once, occasional laughter, the particular sound of people who are in a room together because they want to be. Clara sat between Gideon and Evelyn and ate her pie with focused attention and listened to everything that was said around her with those quiet, observant eyes. Once, during a lull, she leaned slightly toward Evelyn and said something Gideon couldn't hear, and Evelyn bent her head to hear it and then said something back, and Clara nodded and went back to her pie. He asked Evelyn later what she had said. "She asked me if it was real," Evelyn said. "If it was actually going to stay real. What did you tell her?" "I told her yes." A pause. "And then she asked how I knew. And I told her because I'm staying whether it's easy or not." He looked at her. "She seemed satisfied with that," Evelyn said. "She would be," he said. "That's her kind of answer." The drive back to the ranch in the late afternoon was quiet in the good way, the three of them on the wagon bench. Clara drowsy against Evelyn's arm, the horses finding their own pace on the road they knew. The sun was low, and the light had that particular quality it gets in late March on the high plains, thin and slanted and making everything cast long shadows. And the snow was pink at the edges, and the sky above the hills was a color that didn't have an easy name. Gideon drove and did not try to fill the silence. Evelyn looked at the country around them. The hills to the north, the line of cottonwoods along the creek to the west, the wide, pale sky. She looked at it the way she had been looking at it for weeks, he had noticed. The way someone looks at a landscape they are beginning to own in the interior sense, to carry around with them. "It's going to be harder than this," she said. Not unhappily, just as a fact. "Yes," he said. "He's not done making trouble. Not entirely. Probably not. And people will keep talking, some of them. Some of them." She was quiet for a moment. Claire had gone fully to sleep against her, and she shifted slightly to take the weight more comfortably, an instinctive adjustment. "I know all that," she said. "I'm not saying it because I'm worried. I'm saying it because I've spent enough time being surprised by hard things that I'd rather see them coming." "That's a sound approach." "I learned it from you," she said. He glanced at her. She was looking at the road ahead, and in the late light she looked like herself, like the woman who had been standing on Caldwell's station platform in the snow The same person, but with something different in the set of her shoulders. Something that had not been there in November. "What did you learn?" he said. "That you just keep doing the necessary thing," she said. "Without drama, without waiting for it to be easy. You just do it." He looked back at the road. "I've been told I'm unromantic," he said. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "No, you're practical. There's a difference." She settled Clara's weight more comfortably. "I find it restful, actually." Restful. "Like I said, no drama, just the necessary thing." She paused. "Most of my life, the men around me made every situation into a performance. I find the absence of that restful." He thought about that. "I can try to be more dramatic if it helps," he said. She did laugh then, a real one, and Clara stirred slightly against her arm and subsided again. "Don't," Evelyn said. They drove the rest of the way in comfortable quiet, and the ranch came into view as the sun touched the western hills, the house, and the barn, and the familiar line of the slope behind it, and the light was on it in a particular way that made it look, for a moment, like something from a painting rather than a working property full of mud and cold and necessary labor. He brought the horses to a stop in the yard. Clara woke. "Are we home?" she said. "Yes," Evelyn said. Clara got down from the wagon with the slightly unsteady movements of a child roused from a real sleep, and she walked to the house without ceremony and went inside. Gideon climbed down and went to help Evelyn, though she didn't particularly need helping, and she took his hand anyway when she stepped down from the wagon. She stood in the yard for a moment, still holding his hand, looking at the house. "The left side of the porch needs new boards," she said. "I know. That'll be a spring project." "Along with about 12 other things." She glanced at him sideways. "I'll make a list." "That doesn't surprise me," he said. She held on to his hand for a moment longer, standing in the mud of the yard in the last of the afternoon light, with the horses blowing steam beside them and the cold working back in as the sun went down. Then she let go and went inside. He stood there for another moment. The sky was going to purple above the hills, and the first of the stars were thinking about making an appearance, and the land was doing what it always did, indifferent and enormous and present. And he was, he realized, genuinely all right. Not happy in any uncomplicated sense. He was not an uncomplicated man, and this was not an uncomplicated situation, and there was still Victor Ashford and the bank and the talk and the spring work and all the rest of it. But underneath all of it, and stronger than it, he was genuinely all right. He saw to the horses. He got them unharnessed and watered and fed and settled for the night, and the barn was warm with animal heat and the smell of hay, and he worked through it the way he always worked, steadily, without hurry. When he came into the house, the lamp was lit and supper was being organized in the kitchen, and Clara was telling Evelyn something that involved considerable hand gestures, and the house smelled of food and wood smoke and the ordinary end of a day. He hung up his coat. "There's hot water," Evelyn said from the kitchen, without coming to the doorway. She had heard him come in. "Thank you," he said. He washed and came to the table, and they ate together in the kitchen in the yellow light, the three of them, and the talk was of nothing much. Claire's account of something one of the girls at school had said, Evelyn's observation about the weather shifting, Gideon's list of what needed doing on the south fence in the coming weeks. Ordinary things. The kind of things that make up a life when you are actually living one, rather than just getting through it. After supper, after Clara was in bed, Evelyn sat in the chair near the stove with her mending, and he sat across from her with the account book he had been meaning to look through for a week, and the room was quiet in that comfortable way it had become. The stove ticking, the lamp steady, the wind doing whatever it was doing outside the walls. After a while, without looking up from her mending, Evelyn said, "This is the best part." He looked up. "Of the day," she said. "This part. Just this." He looked around the room, the lamp, the warmth, the sound of the fire. "Yes," he said. She went back to her mending. He went back to the account book. Outside, the last of March was moving toward April, and the snow was beginning to mean something different than it had in November, and the land was working its slow way toward the change of season, the way it always did, patient and certain, and entirely without need of anyone's permission. April came in the way it always does in Wyoming, not gently, not with any of the softness that the word spring implies in milder parts of the country. It came in sideways, with mud and cold rain and one last mean snowstorm in the second week that put 6 inches on the ground before relenting. The creek ran high and brown with snowmelt, and the south pasture flooded at the low end, and 3 of the fence posts Gideon had been planning to replace decided not to wait for his schedule and simply gave way in the saturated ground. It was, in other words, a normal April. And the 3 of them worked through it the way the ranch required, together, without discussion of who was responsible for what, because the division had sorted itself out organically over the months, and everyone knew their part. What had changed was the weight of it. Not lighter exactly. The work was the same work. The cold was the same cold, but distributed differently. The way a load feels different when you are carrying it with someone rather than alone. Gideon had forgotten that feeling. He had not realized how thoroughly he had forgotten it until he had it back. Victor Ashford's interference did not disappear overnight. Gideon had not expected it to, and neither had Evelyn, and they had talked about this, had agreed in the practical way they agreed about most things, that the best response to whatever Ashford was doing was to keep doing what they were doing and let time and behavior make the argument for them. It was not a satisfying strategy in the short term. It required patience that neither of them found particularly easy, but it was the right strategy, and they both knew it. The bank situation resolved first. Mercer at the First Territorial Bank was a cautious man by disposition and profession, and cautious men are susceptible to pressure from people with money and connections, which was what Ashford had applied. But cautious men are also fundamentally conservative in the deeper sense, and what Ashford had been doing, stirring up questions about the Hart Creek note in ways that served no clear legitimate purpose, had made Mercer uncomfortable in a different direction. A bank's reputation rested on its reliability and its discretion, and being seen as a tool for a man's personal grievances was neither reliable nor discreet. Gideon found this out on a Tuesday in mid-April when Mercer sent him a note asking him to come in. He went expecting the worst. Some new condition on the note, some pressure point Ashford had found, and instead found Mercer sitting behind his desk with an expression that was both apologetic and businesslike. "I owe you a straight conversation," Mercer said, "about certain inquiries that were made recently regarding your loan." "Go on," Gideon said. "A third party asked questions about the status and terms of your note," Mercer said. "I should not have engaged with those questions as fully as I did. It was not proper, and I have since made clear to the party in question that the bank does not discuss client accounts with outside interests." He paused. "Your note is in good standing, Mr. Hart. It has always been in good standing, and as far as this bank is concerned, that is the entirety of the relevant information." Gideon looked at him. "What changed?" Mercer's expression shifted in a way that was almost uncomfortable. "I had a visit from Owen Harding," he said, "and from Agnes Pruitt. On the same morning, separately, which I suspect was not a coincidence." He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Pruitt's visit was, as you might expect, somewhat more direct than Owen's." Gideon could imagine it with considerable accuracy. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate the clarity." He told Evelyn that evening. She listened, and then she said Agnes Pruitt. "And Harding." "Agnes Pruitt," she said again, with the particular emphasis of a woman who is revising her assessment of someone upward by a considerable margin. "She's difficult," Gideon said. "She's effective," Evelyn said. "There's a difference." She went back to what she was doing, but he could see the thing in her face. The awareness of having been defended, the complicated feeling that produces in a person who is accustomed to managing things alone. It was not an easy feeling to receive, that kind of support. He knew that from his own experience. You spent long enough being self-sufficient, and someone else's intervention felt almost like a violation, even when it was given freely and received gratefully. "I'm going to bring her a pie," Evelyn said after a while. "Agnes? She keeps doing things for us. I'm going to bring her a pie and say thank you properly. She'll say the pie is unnecessary." "I know." A pause. "She'll also eat the whole thing." The social temperature in Millhaven shifted through April in the incremental way that such things shift in small communities. Not all at once, not with any dramatic reversal, but in the accumulated small movements of people who are quietly updating their positions. The women from the Thursday sewing circle, who had shown up at the wedding without being asked, had made their collective opinion visible in that gesture, and in a town of 300, a visible collective opinion carried weight. The ranchers who had been there had mentioned it to their wives, and to the other ranchers they did business with. Will Tanner, who talked to everyone at the feed store and was liked and trusted, had been consistent and straightforward about where he stood. Victor Ashford, by contrast, had made several strategic errors in the weeks following the wedding. He had continued talking, which was one error. The initial wave of rumor and implication had some force to it, but repeating it after the situation had visibly changed made him look less like an aggrieved party and more like a man who couldn't let something go. He had made a comment at the cattlemen's dinner that 3 people who were there described later as vindictive, which was not a quality that played well in a community that valued toughness over spite. And he had apparently made the mistake of saying something dismissive about Agnes Pruitt's character to the wrong person, which Agnes had heard about within 48 hours through channels that remained mysterious and which had produced a response from Agnes that no one who witnessed it described as anything other than definitive. Evelyn heard the story from Mrs. Harding, who had been present at the dry goods store when it happened. She told him, Mrs. Harding said with evident satisfaction, that a man who leaves a woman in the snow with a note has no standing to speak about anyone else's character, and she said it loud enough that Tom Dwyer and both of the Alcott brothers heard every word. Evelyn received this information with the careful expression of a woman who is suppressing a significant number of reactions simultaneously. "And what did he say?" she asked. "Nothing worth repeating," Mrs. Harding said. "He left." But Ashford had not left Millhaven, not entirely, and his presence continued to be a low-level complication through April and into early May. He had genuine business interests in the territory, or claimed to, and he used them as reason to remain, and his remaining meant that the question of what he was going to do next did not fully resolve. The answer came in the second week of May, and it came not from Ashford himself, but from a man named Calhoun who worked as a land agent out of Cheyenne and who arrived in Millhaven on a Tuesday with papers that he showed to 3 different property owners in the area, including, on Wednesday afternoon, Gideon Hart. Gideon was in the yard when Calhoun arrived. The man introduced himself with professional pleasantness, produced his papers, and explained that he was representing a land acquisition interest that was looking at property in the Hart Creek Valley, and that there had been some recent inquiry about the Hart Creek Ranch specifically, and that his client was prepared to make a substantial offer. Gideon looked at the papers. He did not pick them up. "Who is your client?" he said. Calhoun was careful with his answer. The client wished to remain unnamed at this stage of inquiry, which was not uncommon in land acquisition, he explained. Gideon could evaluate the offer on its merits. "I know who it is," Gideon said. Calhoun adjusted his expression without quite changing it. "The offer is serious," Calhoun said. "I'd encourage you to consider it before—" "No," Gideon said. A pause. "Mr. Hart, if you'd take a moment to look at the terms—" "The answer is no," Gideon said. "It will still be no tomorrow and next week, and whatever time he decides to keep trying. You can tell him that." Calhoun folded his papers with the practiced efficiency of a man who has been turned down before and has learned not to take it personally. "I'll convey your response," he said. He got back on his horse and rode out. Evelyn had come to the kitchen doorway during the last part of this exchange. When Calhoun was gone, she came into the yard. "A land agent," she said. "Yes." "Ashford." "Almost certainly." She stood beside him, looking at the gate. "He wants the ranch." "He wants to win," Gideon said. "The ranch is the way he's decided to try it." He looked at the paper Calhoun had left. He had left one even without being asked, the professional habit, and then he picked it up and looked at the offer figure. It was, he had to acknowledge, substantial. He handed it to Evelyn. She read it. Her expression did not change in any dramatic way, but he saw the recognition in it. The acknowledgement that the number was real, that it was not a trivial gesture. "That's a lot of money," she said. "Yes." "More than the ranch is worth by any fair accounting." "Yes." She handed it back to him. "What do you want to do?" He looked at the paper for a moment. He thought about November, the frozen station, the woman in the wedding dress. He thought about January, coming back to the house to find it empty and cold every evening. He thought about the kitchen in December with the lamp between them, and the morning after the blizzard, and the sound of Clara's voice asking Evelyn a question and Evelyn answering it. He tore the paper in half. He tore it again. He dropped the pieces and the April wind took them and scattered them across the yard. "That," he said. Evelyn watched the pieces of paper disperse. Then she went back inside. But the confrontation, if you could call it that, it was too one-sided to feel like a true confrontation, happened on a Saturday morning in the third week of May, in front of Dwyer's General Store, with what felt like a sizable portion of Millhaven present, though afterward different people gave different accounts of exactly how many witnesses there had been. Gideon and Evelyn had driven in together for the week's shopping. Clara was with them, which was not always the case on supply runs, but which was the case this particular Saturday because she had been promised a visit to the dry goods store to look at fabric for a summer dress, a promise that had been made the previous week and was not forgeable. They were loading the wagon when Victor Ashford came down the street. He had, Gideon noted, the look of a man who has made a decision. There was something deliberate in the way he was walking, something that said this was not a coincidence. He stopped on the sidewalk in front of the wagon. "Evelyn," he said, "I'd like a word." Evelyn was standing at the back of the wagon. She turned and looked at him with the particular quality of attention that meant she was assessing rather than reacting. "All right," she said, "say it." He looked at Gideon. Then he looked at Clara, who was standing beside the wagon wheel watching the adult situation unfold with the contained alertness of a child who has learned that these situations sometimes required her to be still and small. "Privately," he said. "No," Evelyn said. His jaw tightened. "What I have to say concerns your future. And your husband's," the word had a quality to it, "financial situation. I think you would want to hear it somewhere we're not—" "Victor," she said his name flatly, without heat. "I have heard everything you have to say, either directly or through the various ways you've been saying it to this town since March. The land agent came on Wednesday. I assume you know that he did, and that you know what Gideon's answer was." She took one step toward the sidewalk, and her voice stayed even. "I don't know what you thought was going to happen. When you left me at Caldwell Station, when you sent someone else with a note, when you showed up at the ranch and made threats, when you talked to the banker and the territorial judge's connections, and anyone else who would listen." She was looking at him directly, and there was nothing frightened in her face and nothing performing either, just a woman saying what was true because it needed to be said in front of people who needed to hear it. "I think you thought that if you made the alternative difficult enough, I'd come back. Or that if I didn't, you'd at least take something from us." A pause. "You have not taken anything. You're not going to take anything." The street was quiet in the way streets get when the people on them have stopped pretending to do other things. Victor looked at her. Something moved through his face. Several things, in quick succession, and then the management of those things, and then what was left after the management, which was the face of a man who has played a hand badly and knows it. "I made an offer," he said, "a more than fair offer." "You made a move," Gideon said from behind Evelyn. His voice was quiet. "Same as everything else you've done since March. There's no offer in it. It's a move." "The offer was legitimate." "The ranch isn't for sale," Gideon said. "It will not be for sale. Whatever you're planning to try next, the answer will be the same." He looked at Ashford with the steady look that said nothing was going to change behind it. "I think you should go back to Cheyenne. I think you have business there that needs your attention more than this does." Victor Ashford stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer. He looked at Evelyn one more time, and what was in his face then was harder to name. Not quite remorse, not exactly, but something in the neighborhood of it. The recognition, maybe, of a man who had had a thing and thrown it away carelessly and was only now understanding fully what he had thrown, and that it was gone. He put his hat on. He walked back up the street without looking at either of them again. Tom Alcott, who had come out of the livery doorway at some point during the exchange, said something low to the man standing beside him. Agnes Pruitt, who had materialized on the sidewalk across the street with 3 of the sewing circle women, said nothing, which from Agnes was a form of approval. Clara, beside the wagon wheel, let out a long breath. "Is he coming back?" she said. "No," Evelyn said. "I don't think so." She was right. Victor Ashford left Millhaven 4 days later. The hotel settled his account and the livery returned his horse, and he was on the stage to Cheyenne by Thursday morning. Whether he had exhausted his interest in the situation or simply made the calculation that further effort was no longer likely to produce results was impossible to know from the outside. What was visible was that he went, and that after he went, the particular quality of tension that had lived in the background of the Hart Creek Ranch since March began, slowly, to dissipate. Spring became summer the way seasons do, not all at once, but through the accumulation of evidence. The grass came in on the north pasture first, then spread to the rest of the property. The creek settled back to its normal level and ran clear again. The meadowlarks came back, which was the thing Clara had been watching for, which she announced at breakfast on the morning she heard the first one. The porch got its new boards in May. Gideon replaced them on a Saturday, with Evelyn holding the boards while he nailed and Clara making unnecessary observations about the quality of the fit from a position of comfortable uselessness on the steps. The work took most of the morning, and the result was solid, the way things were when Gideon built them. In June, Evelyn started a kitchen garden in the patch of ground on the south side of the house that had been fallow as long as anyone could remember. She had been planning it since February, had made notes in a small book she kept in the kitchen, varieties and spacing, and what could grow in the altitude and the length of the growing season. And now she dug it out and prepared the ground with the same thorough approach she brought to everything. Clara helped with the planting, working beside her in the dirt on an afternoon when the light was warm and the air had the smell of turned earth, and Gideon came out and found them that way and stood at the corner of the house for a moment watching before either of them noticed him. Clara had dirt up to her elbows and was arguing with the specific confidence of a 7-year-old that the row spacing Evelyn had marked was incorrect. "It's too wide," Clara said. "The seeds will be lonely." "Seeds don't get lonely," Evelyn said, with the patience of a person who has learned not to dismiss Clara's theories until she has heard them out. "What they get is root-bound if you put them too close. How do you know they won't be lonely? Because they don't have feelings." "You don't know that." Evelyn sat back on her heels and looked at Clara with an expression that was caught somewhere between exasperated and amused. "All right," she said. "We'll split the difference. The middle rows will be closer together. If the seeds feel better about it, they can let us know." Clara appeared to find this acceptable. Gideon went back to what he had been doing. It was not a simple summer. He would not tell the story that way, even to himself. There were problems with the cattle, a late illness that went through the herd in July and cost him 6 head before it was contained, a loss that strained the cash position and required a renegotiation of the purchase he had been planning to make in the fall. There was a dispute with a neighboring property about the water rights on the east branch of the creek that required 3 separate conversations with the man and 1 conversation with Owen Harding before it was resolved, and it was resolved in a way that was fair rather than favorable, which was the best that could realistically be expected. Evelyn had a hard month in August, though she did not name it as such. He noticed it, the way she went quiet sometimes in the evenings, not the comfortable quiet she had developed in the months at the ranch, but something with more weight to it. He asked once, and she said she was fine, and he believed that was partly true, and let her have the space to work through whatever she was working through. A week or so later, she came to him in the evening and said that she had been thinking about the spring, about the period when Ashford was making his moves, and that she had been angry about it in a delayed way, the anger showing up now that it was safe to feel it. "That happens," he said. "I know. It's just inconvenient timing. Anger doesn't ask about timing." She looked at him. "No," she said. "It doesn't." A pause. "Are you angry? About Ashford?" He thought about it. "Not anymore. Maybe I was, in March. Now I don't think about him much." "That seems healthy." "Or I just have too much else to deal with," he said. She almost smiled. Also possible. He reached over and put his hand briefly over hers on the table. Not a long gesture, just present. "The anger will move through," he said. "It does." She turned her hand and held his for a moment. "I know," she said. "I know it will." Clara turned 8 in September, and they had a small celebration, a cake that Evelyn made with dried fruit, which was elaborate by the ranch's usual standards, and a gift from Gideon that was a proper penknife, which Clara had been wanting for several months, and which he had been holding off on until he thought she was ready for it, and a gift from Evelyn that was a journal with a red cloth cover and a small brass clasp, because Evelyn had noticed that Clara had opinions about things that deserved to be written down. Clara received both gifts with the gravity appropriate to the occasion. She held the journal for a while after, running her thumb over the clasp. "What do I write in it?" she said. "Whatever you want," Evelyn said. "What you see, what you think about, whatever seems important." "What if I write something embarrassing?" "Then it'll be in the journal and not in conversation, which is the advantage of a journal." Clara considered this. "Do you have one?" "I did for a while, when I was your age and older." "What happened to it?" A small pause. "I left it behind when I came here," Evelyn said. "I didn't need what was in it anymore. I was writing a different—" She stopped. "I was ready for different things." Clara looked at her. "A different story," she said. Evelyn looked at her steadily. "Yes, a different story." Clara opened the clasp and looked at the first blank page, and then she closed it again carefully and said she needed to think about what the first thing should be. Gideon cut the cake. The tree went in on the last Saturday of September. It had been Evelyn's idea, proposed one morning over coffee with the same practical directness she brought to suggestions about the fence line or the kitchen organization. Not sentimental in its framing, just a thing she thought should be done. "There's a good spot on the hill behind the barn," she said. "It gets enough light. A cottonwood would take there, I think, if you put it in before the ground freezes." He looked at her. "It would be visible from the house," she said. "From the kitchen window." He understood what she was not quite saying directly. A living thing. Something that would be there in 10 years and 20 years, growing. Something that said this place was intended to be inhabited by people who were planning ahead. "All right," he said. Saturday. They put it in on a cool, clear morning, the three of them on the hill with a shovel and a sapling and the September light coming across the land at a low angle the way it does when the season is turning. The ground was still workable. Another week and it would have been borderline, another 2 and it would have been impossible. They had timed it correctly. Gideon dug the hole. Clara held the sapling. It was perhaps 3 feet tall, a little crooked at the top. Not a particularly impressive specimen, but healthy, while Evelyn backfilled the earth around the roots and tamped it down firmly. They stood back and looked at it. It was, in its current state, not much to look at. A stick, essentially, on a hill. "It's going to take years before it does anything visible," Gideon said. "I know," Evelyn said. "Might not make it through the first winter. It might not," she agreed. "But if we don't put it in, it definitely won't." He looked at her. She was looking at the sapling with the expression of someone who is not particularly interested in the short view. Clara was looking at the sapling too. "What do we do now?" she said. "Water it," Evelyn said, "and then leave it alone and let it do what it does." Clara seemed to find this a reasonable answer. She had brought a bucket up the hill, anticipating this, and she watered it with the focused attention she gave to tasks she considered important. Then she stood up and looked at the view from the hill, the ranch below them, the house and the barn, the creek line to the west, the country opening out in every direction under the autumn sky. "You can see everything from up here," she said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "I'm going to come up here and write in my journal," Clara said. "That's a good place for it." Clara looked at the sapling one more time. "I'm going to name it," she said. "Trees should have names." "All right," Gideon said, with the resignation of a man who has learned that this kind of statement from his daughter does not benefit from argument. "What are you going to name it?" Clara thought about it for a moment, with the seriousness she brought to decisions of this kind. "Margaret," she said. The name fell quietly into the morning air. Gideon looked at his daughter. Evelyn was very still beside him. "After Mama," Clara said simply. "She would have liked to see the ranch from up here, I think. Now she can." Neither adult said anything for a moment. Then Evelyn said, "That's a good name." Gideon looked at the sapling on the hill, small and crooked and new, with his daughter's name for it already settling into the ground around it. He looked at the ranch below, the repaired porch, the kitchen garden going brown and dry in the September cold, the barn where the horses were, the house where the lamp burned in the mornings before the sun got to it. He thought about what it takes to keep a thing alive. Not just the practical requirements, the water, the right ground, the protection from the elements, but the decision to try. The decision that something is worth tending, even when tending is uncertain, even when the thing you are tending might not survive the first hard winter. He had made that decision once before, for this ranch, for Clara, in the first year after Margaret died. And he had made it again in November when he turned the horses off the road at Caldwell Station. He had not known what he was deciding either time. You never really know. You just decide that the thing in front of you is worth the effort and you act accordingly, and you see what takes root. Not everything does. That was the truth of it, and it deserved to be stated plainly rather than softened. Not everything you plant survives. Not every decision to stop and help produces something that lasts. Some of the time you put the sapling in, and the first winter takes it, and you are left with the empty hole in the hill and the loss of something that might have been. But some of the time it holds. Some of the time the roots go down into the cold ground and find what they need, and the thing survives the winter, and then the next one, and you look up one day and there is shade where there was none before, and the shade was made from nothing but the decision to try and the patience to wait. That was not a lesson you could teach someone. It was a thing you had to learn by doing it, by being the person who turned the wagon off the road, or stayed at the bedside, or said yes across a kitchen table in March. And even then you did not learn it once and have it settled. You had to keep learning it, keep making the decision, because the decision had to be made over and over in new forms, and each time it required the same thing, which was the willingness to not know how it was going to turn out, and keep going anyway. Gideon was 40 years old, and he had made mistakes and lost things, and spent 2 years narrowed down to the essential functions of survival, and he did not think of himself as a man who had figured something out. He was not that kind of story, but he was standing on a hill in September with his daughter and the woman he had married, looking at a small crooked tree with his dead wife's name, and the ranch was below him, and the country was wide in every direction, and something in him that had been closed for 2 years was open. That was enough. That was, in fact, quite a lot. The talk about Hart Creek Ranch did not disappear entirely. Small towns don't work that way. The sediment of a story stays in the water long after the disturbance that stirred it up has passed. People who had made up their minds about Evelyn in the early months, or about the arrangement, or about what Victor Ashford's version of events implied, those people did not all revise their opinions cleanly and completely. But opinions are living things, and they respond to evidence, and over the months and into the following year, the evidence was continuous and consistent. A working ranch, a functioning family, a woman who showed up when the creek flooded the Tanner property in spring and helped sandbag for 3 hours without being asked. A man who was at every community meeting and every fire call and every situation that required someone to show up. A little girl who grew an inch over the winter and started school in the fall and did her lessons with the focused competence of a child who had someone at home who thought education mattered. Agnes Pruitt said at some point during that following spring that Evelyn Hart was the most capable woman in the territory and that she had said so from the beginning, which was not entirely accurate but close enough that no one felt the need to correct her. Evelyn heard about it from Mrs. Harding, as she heard about most things. "What did you say?" Gideon asked. "I said thank you," Evelyn said, "and I took her another pie." "What kind?" "Apple. She has a preference." "I've noticed," he said. "How many pies does that make?" "4, she said. "I'm not counting." "You're definitely counting." She looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile but was in that direction. "I'm counting," she confirmed. The cottonwood on this hill survived its first winter. Clara checked on it every week through the cold months, trudging up the slope to look at it. Gideon was never sure what she was looking for, some sign of life that was invisible to him, some quality of the bark or the buds that told her something about how the thing was doing. She reported on it at intervals. "It's fine," she said in January. "It's still fine," she said in February. "I think it's going to be fine," she said in March, with the cautious optimism of someone who has learned not to count on things too early. In April, when the snow pulled back and the ground softened, there were new buds on the small branches. Not many, but there. Clara came down from the hill on the morning she found them and reported this to both of them at breakfast, with the contained excitement of a child who has been vindicated in a position she was not certain about. "It worked," she said. "So far," Gideon said, because he had his own habits around counting things too early. "It worked," Clara said again, firmly, with the particular conviction of a 7, almost 8-year-old who has decided how something is. Evelyn looked at Gideon across the table. Something passed between them. The quick, wordless exchange of two people who have learned to read each other, who have been in enough mornings together to know what the other is thinking without having to ask. He looked at the kitchen window. From where he was sitting, he could not see the hill, but he knew it was there, and he knew what was on it, and he knew that in 10 years it would be a real tree, and in 20 years it would be the kind of tree you could sit under on a summer afternoon if you were inclined to that kind of thing. He thought about all the mornings that stood between now and then, the necessary ones, the hard ones, the ones that were just ordinary, which were most of them. He thought about who would be at this table for those mornings, and found that he knew the answer, and found that it was a good one. "All right," he said to Clara. It worked. Clara nodded with satisfaction and applied herself to her breakfast. The morning light came through the kitchen window the way it always did, at the angle that changed as the seasons changed, and the stove was warm, and outside the April world was doing what it does every year without fail. Coming back, unreliable and cold and imperfect and insistent, the way living things do, the way all the things worth keeping always do.